This video is sponsored by Nebula. In my junior year of college, I read the short story The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. An early example of feminist American literature, it used a diary-like framing to illustrate the abuses that women faced when it came to mental health. Our nameless protagonist is going through what we would now call postpartum depression. Her husband, John, sends her to a family estate and puts her in a nursery covered in yellow wallpaper for a rest cure. The color is repellent, almost revolting, a smoldering, unclean yellow, strangely faded by the slow-turning sunlight. It is a dull yet lurid orange in some places, a sickly, sulfur tint in others. No wonder the children hated it. I should hate it myself if I had to live in this room long. There comes John. I must put this away. He hates to have me write a word. Over the course of her stay in the room, her needs being neglected and told to relax, she succumbs to madness. All she wants to do is escape, and since she can't do so physically, she goes into her own mind. Gilman was a humanist and eugenicist and deeply problematic. I'd recommend reading Hallie Butler's The Trouble with Charlotte Perkins Gilman to get a better idea of her racist and problematic history. In spite of that, what I got out of The Yellow Wallpaper was a fascinating way in which madness shows up in women's fiction, how abusive power from men was littered throughout literature. You have Bertha Rochester in Jane Eyre, the Jamaican-born mad wife that the protagonist's love interest locks away in his home and whose literary presence inspired Sandra Gilbert and Susan Gabar's The Mad Woman in the Attic, the woman writer and the 19th century literary imagination. You have Mary Wollstonecraft's Unfinished Maria, or The Wrongs of Women, about a woman who is imprisoned in an insane asylum by her husband. These fictional stories have real-world parallels. You have Louisa Nottage, whose story of being kidnapped by her male relatives and locked away inspired the book The Woman in White. And this wasn't something that just happened in the United Kingdom. Elizabeth Parkins Ware married Theophilus Packard in 1839. Like a lot of women at the time, the marriage was at the urging and insistence of her family, not because they were well matched. Packard was a conservative and strict Calvinist minister, although I think calling someone a strict Calvinist is kind of repetitive. Calvinism is intense. Elizabeth questioned her husband's ministry and decided to start worshiping with the Methodists. This action caused Packard to question his wife's sanity. He asked the doctor to masquerade as a sewing machine salesman and speak with his wife, during which she obviously complained about her husband being an asshole who was telling people she was crazy.
It became personal with me.
So, having that evidence, Packard had Elizabeth forcibly removed from her home and sent to Illinois State Hospital for the Insane. This was legal because at the time, a husband could have his wife committed without either a public hearing or her consent.
I don't think what we have today is really marriage. What is marriage? It's for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, till death do us part.
Despite being clearly of sound mind, the fact that Elizabeth refused to agree with her husband meant that she was kept in the 9th ward for the violent and hopelessly insane, and she was there for 3 years. When her eldest son turned 21, he was able to remove her from the asylum, but home became another prison when her husband, which was the house that she had to return to, placed locks all over the house and she could not even get food without permission. He locked her in this nursery for a month and a half before she was able to get a letter to a neighbor who was able to sue on her behalf. Packard v. Packard started on January 13th, 1864. Mr. Packard had witnesses come and say that Elizabeth did not listen to him and therefore was insane. In comparison, Elizabeth had witnesses come forth and talk about how, yes, she disagreed with her husband, but it did not make her crazy. January 18th, Elizabeth was found sane after 7 minutes by an all-male jury, a rare win for white men collectively. She dedicated her life to therefore getting married women equal rights.
But feminists have ruined marriage for the people that actually believe in marriage.
Yet, this still did not protect all women who would be facing torment, as seen in 1887 when American journalist Nellie Bly published 10 Days in a Madhouse. Bly pretended to be mentally ill and spent 10 days in Blackwell's Island Asylum. She faked being drugged to get there, and then, once admitted, began to act normally. She recounts, My heart ached to see the sick patients grow sicker over the table. I saw Miss Tilly Maynard so suddenly overcome at a bite that she had to rush from the dining room and then got a scolding for doing so. When the patients complained of the food, they were told to shut up, that they would not have as good if they were at home, and that it was too good for charity patients. People have taken issue with Bly's methods, but her work was greatly impactful in seeing the experiences of cruelty given to women who were put in these positions. While these stories focus on white women, including queer white women who were also victims of the asylum, it speaks to the vulnerability of women who had no legal protections, but also the ways in which mental health could be used to control others. It is part of intersectional women's history because of the inability to be heard, to have our needs being met, to have our physical and mental health used against us, the system telling us what's wrong with us versus listening, and the desire fundamentally to escape to somewhere, anywhere, even our own fantasy. And it is with this in mind that I went to go watch in theaters Zack Snyder's Sucker Punch. Yeah, this is Sucker Punch apologia. I am a self-confessed Sucker Punch apologist, mostly. I saw it in theaters. It was the first film I ever owned on Blu-ray, even though I didn't own a Blu-ray player at the time, but you know, physical media forever. I have the art book. I have the vinyl that my friend Aaron got for me for my 31st birthday. It is a film that is really, truly, deeply hashtag for me. So fucking for me. That being said, while I will offer you my thoughtful, and I'm sure some will say overly charitable thoughts on the film, I think this is something that you need to understand about me. I don't take it personally if you disagree. Maggie Mae Fish, who did her own video on Snyder's work, is one of my best friends. I love her so much. She does a voiceover for this very video later on, and she doesn't like Sucker Punch, but she loves me, and that's what really matters. It is just a movie. And yes, I know it's hard to deal with all the disclaimers going up before a video, but considering sometimes the comments that we get for these video essays, it is important to say it's just a movie. I do not care if you disagree. There are plenty of things to critique about this movie. But I wanted to make this video anyway, so here we go. And while the early discourse for the movie made me strong enough to handle the white cis feminism discourse of Barbie, I have zero investment in fighting about a movie that I fully understand why it is polarizing. But in my opinion, to fully understand the discourse around Sucker Punch, why it has such a complicated legacy, and why I like it despite that, you need to go to the director himself, Zack Snyder.
Hi guys, I'm Zack Snyder, and this is the timeline of my career.
Before Sucker Punch, director Zack Snyder made 4 movies: Dawn of the Dead, 300, Watchmen, and The Legend of the Guardians, the Owls of Ga'Hoole, or Ga'Hoole. Either way. Dawn of the Dead is largely considered to be his best film and is a remake of the 70s Romero movie. I prefer the original, but I would agree that it's a very well-made, engaging action film that really keeps the stakes high for the runtime. I think it's probably like in his top work. 300, in my opinion, is probably his most iconic film because like this is like that the trailer for 300, in my opinion, is one of the best trailers for a movie ever. Like it's deeply fucked up, but it's a really good trailer. Like, what would a free man do? This is Sparta. Like that is just like no passengers on her plane.
Our arrows will blot out the sun. Then we will fight in the shade.
You ate that.
But it is probably also what started his reputation of being an anti-woke director. The movie is very, very problematic, and it's filled with Orientalism, ableism, you know, light touching of homophobia, even though, like, you know, the Spartans were definitely I'm gonna censor that for YouTube. And while all of that is true about the movie itself, I do blame more of that on the fact that it's based on the work of Frank Miller. And Frank Miller is a horrible person who had a very big impact on comics. Everything bad about that movie in terms of its subject matter and its phobias, in my opinion, is rooted in the comic. It doesn't excuse Snyder adapting it so thoroughly, but I do think that there's a fundamental issue with the comics that he is pulling into that. Then he did Watchmen, and I do think it's funny to do Miller and then Alan Moore back to back because boy, if there were 2 dramatically opposing forces in comics, it would be, you know, those 2. Watchmen was the first Snyder film I saw in theaters, and it was fine. It's a largely faithful adaptation, save for, of course, the ending and things and side stories being cut for brevity. Now, I'm a cliche. Watchmen is one of my favorite works of literature of all time. I've owned it and rebought it like 7 different times. I also love Viva Vendetta. I don't love From Hell, but I did read the entire thing to have an opinion on it. You know, I read Jerusalem. Like, I really respect his work. And I think it's very hard to adapt something like Watchmen into a single product. And so there are some issues there. But that being said, the casting, and Snyder is excellent at casting overall. The casting is perfect. Like, Jackie Earle Haley as Rorschach, amazing. Patrick Wilson as Night Owl, like, perfect. Jeffrey Dean Morgan as the comedian, like, hitting. Like, it has moments of slapping, but I don't think any adaptation of Moore's work has yet to feel as filling as the original work itself. So I would say, like, Watchmen is a solid installment in the Snyder oeuvre. I never saw the Owl movie. I have no interest, but Patrick A. Willems did a video essay about Snyder that talks about the Owl movie. Really good, highly recommend. So that's my gap in my Snyder knowledge. At the time that Sucker Punch was coming out, it was already announced that Zack Snyder would be doing Man of Steel. And Snyder's mixed critical response as a director was something that people were wary of as someone who was going to be doing the first major reboot of Superman outside of the, you know, the Richard Donner aesthetic that had been established in 1978 and ended with Superman Returns in 2006. So it was a really big deal that someone who was so controversial, but seen as like a very cinematic director, like people enjoyed like his vibes, but didn't think that he was a great storyteller, even though he didn't write a lot of these scripts as well, but that's a whole other story. But his aesthetic was always like a mixed bag, and so I think people were thinking, well, he's done comic book stuff in the past, like what could he bring that's edgy to Superman? So when a number of people went to see Sucker Punch, it wasn't just going to see the first original work of a popular yet divisive director. It was to see what the director of the next era of Superman could deliver. And I said it before and I'll say it again, Snyder's not really a Superman kind of guy. So, Sucker Punch is about a young adult woman named Baby Doll, played by Emily Browning, who is sent to an asylum to be lobotomized. Dang, here, we will get back to that. After accidentally killing her sister during a struggle with her abusive stepfather. She goes on to fantasize that she's in a brothel when she's sent to the asylum, and we enter the first layer of the story. You know what? Spy Family season 1. Okay. Sucker Punch. We're gonna do it. So alright. So there's can you even see that? No. There it is. Okay. Do I have black? Yeah, I do. Okay, sorry. Alright. So the first layer of Sucker Punch, like layer 1 is reality, right? Like that's where we start off. We start off in reality, right? And then we go down to layer 2, and that's when we enter the brothel. And reality is the asylum, okay? All right, so here we go. In this layer is when we are properly introduced to the sisters Sweet Pea and Rocket, played by Abby Cornrich and Jenna Malone, respectively. Blondie, played by Vanessa Hudgens, and Amber, played by Jamie Chung. Oscar Isaacs is Blue Jones, who is the owner of the brothel in this layer, but then also like an aide in this layer. Madame Vera Gorski, who is like a therapist in this, but then like one of the madams in the brothel here is, okay. It's not important. They exist into multiple layers. So during the dance class, while listening to Bjork, which, relatable, a Baby Doll then enters another layer. It's layer 3, okay? And this is the fantasy layer, okay? This is where she becomes essentially Sailor Moon. Okay, and there she meets a wise white man who is dressed up in very Orientalist clothing, who tells her she has to collect some MacGuffins in order to escape. In order to do so, she enlists the other Sailor Scouts to join her, and things are going strong overall until the third act happens, and Snyder decides that we gotta wrap it up. And then in quick succession, they get called out, Amber, Blondie, and Rocket all die, leaving only Baby Doll and Sweet Pea alive. Baby Doll gives up her own life to let Sweet Pea escape, and the former is lobotomized. So that's the general, plot of Sucker Punch, layers and all. So what did audiences think?
Snyder has described it as Alice in Wonderland with machine guns, but it's more like the Pussycat Dolls present steampunk Kill Bill, only more assaultive and pandering than that description suggests.
Snyder pulverizes our senses with derivative digital images and obvious musical choices. But his failure to delineate the levels of reality is confusing and self-defeating.
You've never seen a movie like Sucker Punch, and depending on your entertainment preferences, you may not want to.
To the degree that Baby Doll and her pals are forced into becoming fetish objects, Sucker Punch contains its own critique. Though Joss Whedon's fascinating TV series Dollhouse explored similar themes with far more wit and skill.
This movie isn't bad in the way some incompetently made movies are bad. This is bad because there's much skill evident in a pointless endeavor.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack with all of that. And a lot of it, I would argue, is valid. But I do think that there's an interesting place to start. I talked about madness in the beginning because I think that's tied into the aesthetic of Sucker Punch. But I want to talk into how Sucker Punch fits into the strong women heroines of the era. So, in March of 2011, Jude Doyle wrote Sucker Punch and the Decline of Strong Woman Action Heroines for The Atlantic, where he calls the film, quote, the nadir of a long, slow, steady decline in action films starring women. They compare the women of Sucker Punch to Sarah Connor and Ellen Ripley, but says that there was a backlash to those strong women, and so many action heroines now have been moved into the male gaze with hypersexualization.
The strong woman action heroine may have resonance for women, but she was always based on math. If watching violence is fun, and watching pretty girls is fun, then pretty violent girls will be fun squared. Filmmakers just reverted to that reliable formula. Sure, Quentin Tarantino got to make Kill Bill, he's Quentin Tarantino. But as for the rest of it, we got a slew of interchangeable ultraviolets and underworlds with interchangeable latex and leather-clad heroines, and a revivified Charlie's Angels franchise for those who preferred their action in a bikini. You could blame the shift on Lara Croft's skin-tight outfits, Tarantino's fetishistic recreations of the exploitative flicks from which female action heroines emerged, or even Buffy and her girl power miniskirts. But at least two of those three things had redeeming value.
What's that do?
And redeeming value is expendable if you assume your audience would be satisfied with miniskirts and exploitation.
So I have a deep respect for Doyle and their work. I'm actually one of the quotes for their book Trainwreck under the Bus magazine article in the paperback, if last I checked. While I understand this criticism, I also find it deeply exhausting because it's so wrapped up in rising up this white standard of the female action star that is largely constructed and developed by men without exception. Almost always, save for Pam Grier and maybe Lucy Liu and Michelle Yeoh for being generous, they are talking about white characters. They're also talking about films where there's a sole exceptional woman in the story. This whole back and forth we have about how much violence for an action heroine is allowed, but they mention the fact that there's a lot of sexual violence being alluded to in the film Sucker Punch, while also mentioning Kill Bill, which tells us that Bellatrix has been getting assaulted the entire time she's been in a coma. The first person we actively see her kill in the film is her attempted rapist. Ripley is an amazing character, but the first Alien film still has a weird, unnecessary panty shot that I think is very out of place, and every time I see it I'm like, I don't understand why this is here. And the characters that get the most praise as being, radical female action leads were characters that were often originally written as male characters that got cast as women. We should think about what that means, that we're still associating female power as being as separate from miniskirts as possible. I remember going on feminist blogs and on Tumblr and reading that if you like Sucker Punch, you aren't a real feminist, and then seeing in those same spheres that the most feminist character of all time would be someone like Scarlett O'Hara. And I internalize that a lot because I do understand that empowering and entertaining is separate from feminism. I talked about that in my last video, Twilight. Like, it's not all the same. Feminism is about politics. It's about the political realities of women. And a film being feminist needs to reflect that in some way. I would, however, point out that in a sense, while done in an uneven way, Sucker Punch has more to say about that than Barbie. Which I know, that's a bold statement. It's a wild statement. It's my hot take. But I stand by that. Barbie reads out Gender 101 to you, and that's fine. There's an audience for that. And I think, as my colleagues have addressed, that can also lead to a limited examination of feminism. But just because it's shallow to some doesn't mean it's not necessary for others. But you can't deny that it's spoon-fed with corporate sugar. And I think the things that Sucker Punch touches on, familial abuse, sexual violence in institutions, the sexist realities of lobotomies used to silence women and queer people, isn't just exploitation because the film is not good. Like, I'll be fair, the film is not good enough to tell all these stories exceptionally well, but it's not exploitative, in my opinion, in the way it handles this. I did want to go back to lobotomies. So lobotomies are one of the darkest periods of medical silence. It was developed by the Portuguese neurologist Antonio Muniz, and the procedure was based on the idea that mental illnesses came from abnormalities in the frontal lobes, and that by removing pieces of it, you could cure those conditions, anything from like schizophrenia to depression to paranoia. And the creator of it would go on to win a Nobel Prize for his work. And while he never performed these surgeries, others would take this technique and make it horrifyingly common. If you've seen BoJack Horseman, you saw an example of it there.
Operation? What's broken in the heart can never be repaired, but the brain, well, we have all sorts of science for the brain.
QK wrote for Attitude that Walter Jackson Freeman II, also known as the father of the lobotomy, performed on gay men, and up to 40% of Freeman's patients were gay men operated on to change their sexual orientation. Jack L. High, who wrote about Freeman, points out in a Medium post that from the 1940s through the mid-1950s, men slightly outnumbered women as patients in state hospitals, yet female patients made up about 60% of those who underwent lobotomy. Lobotomizing women, children, queer people, and weaponizing the legal system against them was a key tool of patriarchal oppression. And I think in Sucker Punch, what's interesting about the film is how, even though in itself, I don't think explains these concepts well, like, again, as I said before, I came into this movie thinking about this topic. So when I was seeing certain elements of the story, I was able to connect it really well to other things. So I said out many words about history and feminism and literature, but I think I just need to acknowledge why I like Sucker Punch. And the real truth of it is that I have fun watching it. It is nice to see a film that is about a group of women coming together to help each other. The fighting scenes are good. And yes, it is nice to see two women of color be present in what is usually an all-white spectacle. What some people got out of Wonder Woman in that no man scene is what I got here. And an even hotter take, I think it's done better here because it is not just one special woman being surrounded by men. It is a group of women who are fighting for their autonomy. While I cannot explain anything that happens after they kill the dragon, it never felt like a pandering movie to me. Women escaping the madhouse together is like such a good premise. I want it all the time. And I know people say that the fighting scenes feel like video game cutscenes with no stakes. And I just want to say, first of all, I like video game cutscenes. And second of all, for the most part, I feel like the action in Sucker Punch is better than the action that we're having now. The thing about the movie that I think is really compelling, but also probably where the problems come up, is because I feel like Snyder wanted to make an anime, and in an interview with his co-writer for the movie, Steve Shibuya for 8 Asians, you get that there was always like this Japanese but like weeb influence on the film. What's interesting is that Zack was already playing with these ideas of dreams, and he has a deep connection with the Japanese culture. He has this painting in this house of this samurai with wild eyes running through the forest with a sword. He's got this deep connection with the culture, and I think a lot of that is reflected in the film. He brought a lot of that with him. There is nothing more precarious than a white man who likes Japanese culture a little too much. and then gets in the film. And I know that Sailor Moon has been talked about in conversation with Sucker Punch, and I have mentioned it before, but I think in a lot of ways, Sucker Punch reminds me of the anime Kill la Kill, which will be an anime court topic for my next month episode of Anime Court. Sorry about the delay with that, but I have been super busy dealing with a lot of family stuff, but it's coming up next month. I'm really excited about it, especially in the sense that the aesthetics of the product, the schoolgirl outfit, the fan service, which I would argue in Sucker Punch, I don't really think it's fan service. I think it's just like the difficulty of like having a skirt and fighting. But again, I can take the argument either way. It's fine. I don't think it that way. But all of it distract from the seriousness of the subject matter surrounding it, to the point of asking, does something like this deserve this kind of subject matter? If we open with the framing device of a girl accidentally killing her sister while trying to save her from an attempted assault, and then being sent to get lobotomized, are we then ready to see this girl in a school skirt taking down a machine gun swinging samurai? I am. But I also like have Kill la Kill art in my apartment. And Sucker Punch is not as good as Kill la Kill. Let's be frank about that. It isn't as good as it needs to be, in my opinion, to sell the ideas it's talking about in terms of the movie, even though I love it. But I think, just like any woman who dates men, I love its potential. I love its vibe. I love its cast. I love that all the women who were a part of this film talk about how it made them strong and empowered. And you can see that in the fighting sequences. And I think that's why, as much as I adore this film, and I do not think it's as bad or as exploitative as others do, I do understand why it fails. It is asking a lot of its audience and stumbles the landing. And I think the way that Snyder wants to express the way in which trauma can make people escape into themselves makes sense, but not when you add this many layers to the story. It has like almost worse Inception logic. And I think fixing Sucker Punch as a film doesn't require an entire restructuring, but it does require shifting attention at the beginning to feed into the world building. Like, Sucker Punch takes place in like the 50s and 60s, even though it's not entirely clear. I think the biggest problem is with Baby Doll as a protagonist is that she's a blank slate. I think that Emily Browning doesn't really do her strongest work in it. I know she's capable of doing better, but she's just kind of like wide-eyed the entire time, and it's very distracting. But I think if we're supposed to be seeing her dissociative thinking and it manifesting in her wanting to be like this warrior, then we need to see that she is someone who would imagine those things. Or even yet, you like pull a Batman and have her come home from the movies, from seeing something like Hidden Fortress, and you go to her room and we see movie posters about all of the genres we will be exploring in the film, like a dragon movie, like a King Arthur thing, all of that. Then you have the screen from the sister, and it's like bada bing bada boom, you have like the narrative set up of her being someone who's interested in not just this stuff, but why this would be her escapism. In Escaping the Sentence, Diagnosis, and Discourse in the Yellow Wallpaper, the writer Paula A. Trechler says that the narrator develops an artificial feminine self as a defense mechanism to try and perform the femininity that is expected of her, the sanity that is expected of her. The death of her sister by her hand is something that can be framed as happening while she's in this liminal space, with it being this moment that Baby Doll's fantasies start to become dissociated artificial selves to cope. For me, if we go back to our helpful chart of layers, which you can barely see because of the lights, for me, the switching of the mental hospital to be like a brothel, Moulin Rouge style environment makes sense symbolically because of the way sexuality and exploitation and asylums work. That being said, it's a distraction. It makes the story so cluttered. So I would say we lead into the 50s, 60s faux picture of normalcy, like a Don't Worry Darling type thing, and have the fantasy elements be pushing up against that constantly. And then you have the moment where it goes full anime being something like one thing that happens in therapy. Because essentially what she tells her about like, all you have is your own stuff, is therapy speak anyway. So I feel like this layer right here needs to go, and this is the disassociation, and the asylum and these two can be linked, because as many horror video games have told us, you can do a lot just here. You didn't need to make up a whole nother thing. I do wish that one of the non-white characters got to escape, and I think that Baby Doll sacrificing herself to protect someone else is powerful in the context of the movie. I just think it's rushed so much that even the extended cut doesn't really do enough to make the whole story work the way it should, and that's a shame because I think there was a lot of potential here.
Who is Zack Snyder? It's kind of everything we've been talking about.
I was listening to the audiobook of You Again, which I really enjoyed. It was Raylo fanfic that I didn't know, even though they all look like Adam Driver, and it drives me crazy. Like, stop doing that. I got trapped, but I ended up really liking it. I do like it. It's a really fun romance. I like that the characters are messy. You know, like the main female character is like a messy bisexual with nipple piercings, and I was like, finally, someone who I can relate to in fiction. During the book, the main female character is trying to get the male character to say something bad about his ex, and like essentially goes like, what, did she really obsess about the Snyder cut? And I was just like, Snyder's reputation as a filmmaker has 10,000% been co-opted by his fan base's actions, which is unfortunate because all of the rumors and mentions of him, he seems like a really great, nice, decent, liberal guy. Like, even the fact that he seems to have become this alt-right darling seems to not really make sense, with the exception of 300 and Watchmen. You know, he has a very diverse cast of movies. He replaced an actor who was accused of sexual allegations with Tig Notaro with like no effort. He defended and supported Ray Fisher. He's one of the few people who has vocally defended Amber Heard and said that he would work with her again despite all the slander and harassment that she faced during the Depp v. Heard trial. I would never ever want him to make a superhero movie again because I don't think he understands Superman. But he doesn't seem like some alt-right god. And I will admit, I like the Snyder Cut. I think Justice League, the Snyder Cut is actually a pretty, very good superhero movie. I like it quite a lot, actually. But as someone who's worked for a feminist website, it is unfortunate that a very vocal, significant amount of Snyder fans have been shitty and has only served to hurt his legacy and his name, because the goodwill that he has is by his actions, not his work itself. And Sucker Punch is in many ways the film that really makes me enjoy Snyder as a director. In my opinion, he clearly likes women. I think he likes women in almost like a William Marston kind of way. Explainer are going to be on the side, but I think he has failed to pull back at moments where it's necessary. Personally, I think that if he had worked with like a female writer or co-director, I think he just needed someone who can pull back with him. I think like a lot of really great directors are great because they had really good editors who were there to be like, let's pull this back, let's push this around. And I think that with a little bit of work and tweaking, it could have been great. 2014, The Dissolve wrote an article where they called Mako Mori weak because, quote, her past trauma blocks her from being effective in mecha combat and endangers everyone around her. But even when she proves her strength, he, the main male character, still has to assert himself by knocking her out and dumping her limp body as he heads off to save the day in the end. And I was reading this as doing research for this, I was really shocked. And it made me revisit Kat Coker's The Mako Mori Fan Club article, where they write, Mako represents one of the very few Asian women in post-World War II American filmmaking who is not a prostitute, is not evil, and is not dead by the end. Japanese American fans were vocal in expounding the cultural resonances of a bilingual heroine who is not shamed for using imperfect English or dropping back into Japanese and calling her mentor sensei. Several moments in the film featured untranslated Asian languages, as when the Wei triplets discuss Raleigh in Chinese, or when Mako tells her mentor she loves him with Japanese inflections of great respect. To be non-American is not to be exoticized, but to be non-American, no more, no less. Culture like gender denotes part of a character, but not the defining point of that character. In the narrative as given, it would have been easy to other Mako through her language, to make her status as a Jaeger pilot special in a way that Raleigh is not. Instead, Mako's status as a hero was only reinforced. It's so weird because in the environment I was growing up with, the idea that Mako Mori is not seen as the lead and the hero of Pacific Rim does not compute. Although that sequel didn't help, child. But we're not talking about that. That's not what we're talking about today. Yeah, but while Pacific Rim is a much better movie than Sucker Punch, I think it ties into the similar concept of that we don't all agree on what empowerment looks like. Even among those of us who are feminists, because we're all trying to fill in what we need because we're still people. You know, I enjoy Sucker Punch because, among many other things, I do want to be in a miniskirt with a sword and fight monsters. I want to do it. You know, if I could be dressing like Black Canary and Black Cat and Black storm because they are allowed to own their sexuality and power at the same time. And I must also acknowledge that they are still working for the male gaze and under the white gaze, and I was raised under that gaze, so it's gonna be part of my life forever, gonna be deconstructing it forever. I accept that. I don't have all the answers, but I can say that being hot and having a sword is undefeated. And I feel like Sucker Punch hits that note for me in a way that a lot of other films did not at the time. And while things have gotten better and we have gotten better movies, and I still will argue that I don't think that Sucker Punch hits the perfect balance of this topic, I do think that it fits my own internalized desire for seeing women kick ass, having them have strong bonds with each other. And I wish there was just more options that gave me both. I wish it wasn't always an exceptional woman and then like fighting. Like my biggest problem with the Wonder Woman movies, besides Gal herself, is the fact that those movies don't include many women. And it's very frustrating to watch a film where only one woman gets to be cool for the whole movie. I don't like it. Anyway, stay safe, and remember, if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything. This video is sponsored by Nebula, the creator-built platform that many of my favorite creators, and me, are a part of. I know I'm biased because I'm friends with so many people on this platform, but it really is filled with some of the most fantastic insights and exclusive content of so many people that I deeply respect. Some of the most recent ones are Brody Deschanel's series, Taboo on Screen, which has the latest installment. Super fascinating if you're a fan of old Hollywood especially. Anita Sarkeesian's That Time When. I also decided to put my own exclusive content series, Anime Court, on there, which in its first episode got into the issues with the Inuyasha spin-off series Yashahime, exploring how the series not only let down its built-in audience, but how its failures speak to a larger issue of how women are treated in shonen. Yes, even popular shonen written by women. As I mentioned in this video, I will be talking about Kill la Kill this month, so coming up soon there'll be a lot of really fun things for anime fans to be enjoying from me this Women History Month. But say you hate me, which, ouch. There's also Lindsay Ellis's Ballad of John and Yoko, which, again, I'm biased because that's my Moon and Stars, but it's one of the most interesting looks at not just the Beatles, but the way in which male figures are lauded as geniuses and yet somehow also infantilized, and the women they love or are connected with are demonized. I've always grown up hearing about Yoko Ono as a albatross around the Beatles' necks and just being a figure of mockery. So it was really interesting to get this insight into who she was, her relationship with John and the Beatles, and also the way she got blamed for things for not showing grief appropriately. The video also touches on the sexism faced by Courtney Love, Amber Heard, and Meghan Markle, to name a few. Nebula is also producing 2 feature-length movies right now, Identities by Jessie Gender and Dracula's Ex-Girlfriend by Abigail Thorne, aka Philosophy 2, the latter of which got covered in Variety. Ever heard of it? Trademark Caitlin Durante. If you're interested in seeing all of my Nebula exclusive content and those of the many creators on Nebula you know and love, if you sign up using the link below, you can support me directly and get Nebula for a 40% off annual plan, as little as $2.50 a month, which will give you access to all that affirmation content as well as Nebula classes. Thank you so much for supporting myself and other creators, and stay foxy, interwebs.